Hey everyone. I hope you like my title card back there in the upper room today because needed a little bit of a quieter space with the food pantry going on. No big deal. Good to be here with all of you for today's video. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about church spaces, and kind of what we communicate by our spaces in church. This is something I think that has always been understood, and I don't know if there's a correct way, but I definitely know that a perfectly correct way, but I definitely think there are incorrect ways of doing it. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And to start us off on this journey that we're going to be going on here, I wanted to start with Acts 4. We're going to be in the New Testament today. We're going to be two sections of Acts and then one section of Romans. So this is the end of Acts chapter 4. Let me pull this up for you guys. I can see it, but you can't. There we go. So it says, this is the section with the believers share their possession. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. So here it shows kind of the way that the early church would carry themselves. And this says a lot about like kind of the act of church in the sense of not worship, but at community. But you'll notice that when we think of church these days, even for the best of us with our best minds, right? When we think of church, we think of building first, right? Where people would gather to worship. And that's what ecclesia in Greek, that's church, means. It means an assembly. So it's an assembling of people together for the purpose of worship. And I think that, at least that's how the early church used it. It was originally actually used for like an assembly of the citizens in like a city or something like that. But ecclesia within the church context is assembling for worship. But like we have such a fascination with buildings and spaces within those buildings, on like how that affects us and things like that. And I think it's worth talking about kind of what the early church's view of that was, or what that kind of looked like. So I'm going to go to Romans real quick. This is Romans 16. So this is Paul's final, close these ads, jeez. Paul's final words that he's giving. He's giving personal greetings. That's how you would end letters, right? You would do your whole letter, and then the final part of a letter would be used to greet people. So he first commends the woman he sent as from a deacon from the church in Cenchrea, and it's Phoebe. Her name is Phoebe, and he sends her to bring the message and read it to the congregation. So that's the first person that he says. He says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchrea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been a benefactor of many people, including me. So you can see this idea of sharing and things like that is still alive and well. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets at their house. So one of the things that's interesting is that these would be letters that would be sent to cities, right? It's actually, that's what we call it, to the Romans. And usually this would be, we like to think of this as being one group of people within Rome. Chances are, at least the way that it seems that these letters worked, is that these would be letters that would be brought and then circulated to all of the churches. So when they say the church in Rome, they're referring to all of these different house churches. Right here is clear that there's some people that are going to hear this that are from Priscilla and Aquila's house church, but there's also some who aren't from their church, and they're going to have this letter too. And so it's really important that we understand that the earliest buildings that Christians worshipped in weren't catacombs, right? Everyone thinks that Christians were in catacombs, not usually where they worshipped. They would bury their dead in catacombs, but most Christians worshiped in homes. So members would open up their homes and have other people come, and then they would all worship there together, hearing someone preach. That seems to be kind of the original, and they would break bread and do the communion. That seems to be the earliest form of worship that everyone would partake in all the time. So we know this, by the way, not only from these little hints, but from Acts 20. So this is a great story. This is at Troas. So this is actually kind of in near modern, well, not modern day, I guess. It's in northwestern Turkey near Troy. So on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. This is important to note also, just for if you've ever wondered why Christians don't meet on the traditional Sabbath day of the Jews, it's because we see here that in the New Testament, in the New Covenant, the day of rest was moved and worship was moved from Friday into Saturday into Sunday, the first day of the week, because that's the day that Jesus raised, and we can see that here. So it's kind of interesting for that. So this is where, like, you know, people like Seventh-day Adventists and some of the people that hold to the old way kind of end up running into problems. I'm sure they have ways of explaining this away, but it's pretty clear that that's what happens. So Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. So they get together for a worship service, probably at nighttime. That seems actually to be when they would do most of these things, the evening services instead of morning services, which is kind of interesting. He intended to leave the next day, and he kept on talking until midnight. So Paul's going on preaching. And one of the things that you have to remember about Paul is that Paul is, he, by his own admission, not the best preacher in the world. Like, he actually is, he's good if you listen to what he has, but, like, he clearly wasn't very dynamic in a way that, like, preachers are meant to be. So it's really interesting, or not meant to be, but are seen to be by others, right? That you're supposed to be this really dynamic speaker. If you're not dynamic, if you're not hitting all the points, then you're not a good speaker. Paul here is clearly one of those people that shows that that's not a necessary thing. What matters more is teaching, which is always good for preachers like me who aren't very good. But so he keeps on talking. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. Luke uses the first person plural here, so he's talking about himself too. He was here for this. And so they're in someone's house, right? There's a window, because seated in a window is a young man named Eutychus. And so they're all sitting in the upper room, which is where you would eat. And they were sitting up there, and a guy is sitting in the window, and Paul was talking on and on. That's what Luke uses here. And Eutychus falls asleep. And when he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. So he falls out of the window and dies. He falls 30 feet, right? Assuming, you know, I don't think it would have been exactly 10 feet per level as we kind of use them now, but let's just say, it was far distance, far enough to die. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. "Do not be alarmed," he said. "He's alive." Then he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. After talking until daylight, he left. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. So Paul brings him back from the dead here, basically, or heals him. And so they go up and they have communion, and communion was more, you would also eat during this time. It wasn't just a little bread thing. You would actually sit there and have a full meal, which is really cool. And so then they leave. And so you have here a really interesting example of church and how church looked and met in the early period of the Christian time, right? Over time, we add a lot of stuff into it. Christians end up taking the forms, and I don't mean this in the bad way. People do what they're comfortable with, and I don't think the Bible has a problem with this, unless it goes too far in some directions. But people would take the generally pagan forms of worship and then end up doing that. Like, so for instance, a lot of the services that even we have, like the traditional kind of service structure outside of things that are said, follows pretty closely the ritual practices of the ancient world, which is why we can read stuff and not be alarmed when it talks about them doing things, right? It ends up looking a lot like it's basically, Christian worship is basically like pagan worship mixed with Jewish worship, and they come together. And that makes complete sense, right? Because you have it coming, it's like Christianity is Judaism, coming out, like, not in the way that most modern people would understand that, but like it comes from that root, and then it ends up engrafting a lot of Gentiles. And of course people are going to bring what they know, just like we bring what we know today to the church, and that informs our worship. And this happens all over the world in all different cultures. You're going to see people, especially from like the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and Eastern Orthodox churches, claim that they've always worshipped this way. That's bogus. It's not how, and I'm not here claiming as a Presbyterian that the way that we do it on Sundays is always how it's been done. Clearly from this, it hasn't. And we know this because people are meeting in houses. Some of the things that we do now were unable, you couldn't do them in houses, right? There just wasn't a place to do it. So you see a lot of people getting baptized in rivers and things like that because those were the sources of water that were around. You didn't have baptistries in your home. Now we're going to talk about how that later happened, kind of in this middle point where we start to see things change, because I want to go through a little bit of the history of Christian worship and buildings and stuff like that. But I just wanted to really hit that at this point, right, people are meeting in homes in the early church. And I'm not going to sit here and say, I'm going to move myself for this next one, that's a good and best way of doing things. I think there's something to commend it. I don't have a problem with buildings of worship and things like that. I think everything has trade-offs and positives, and the only thing we can say is if we really wanted to be super authentic to the whole style, literally, of the early church, it would have to be in a house church and things like that, right? That's what we would do. But I think over time people realize that you're able to have more room if you get certain buildings to do this sort of thing, right? Houses are small, and if you have a smaller congregation, you can meet in someone's house. But if you have a big church, hundreds of people, whose houses are you going to meet in, right? So we have the next thing. The reason I wanted to talk about this is because this is J.D. Greear. He's a famous Southern Baptist pastor. He was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, if my memory serves me, from a few years ago. And so he's really famous. And so this is from one of his sermons. And I want to say before that this is taken out of context somewhat, because people are kind of ragging on him, and you're going to see why here. He's doing this. He's being particularly blunt here because he's preaching on James, and James is blunt. And of course, like, everyone knows their pastor's own idiosyncrasies. Like, you guys know mine if you go to our church. And so you'll understand over time how things are meant to be taken. Right, but if you just see a clip of me online or a clip of me out of context or something like that, you could see very easily that people might not like me all that much. And he's trying to make a point here, and I think his point is actually good, which is that churches need to be, like, I listened to his sermon, churches need to be more hospitable. That's really what it was talking about, which is interesting because that has a lot to do with homes, right? Things like that, hospitality. But you're going to see why what he says here is interesting because of how his church looks. So let's listen to him.
It's one of the things, honestly, that irritates me about you guys that cruise in 10 minutes late or leave 5 minutes before we dismiss. It's not that I'm mad that you're missing part of the service. It's that you treat church like a religious show instead of a welcoming family that you're a part of. When people say that the church is unfriendly and it feels like a big production, you're the problem. And
now, so I actually don't disagree with what he's saying there entirely, right? Like, a lot of people, like, we do have a very consumerist mindset when it comes to churches in the United States. And one of the things that's important is he also, here you think he's talking about people who walk in, and he is somewhat, but he's actually mostly addressing people online, because online stuff is like the big thing now, right? That they show up late, they leave early, they get to do whatever they want, type of thing. And I completely understand that. From my perspective, I agree that if unless there's a pressing need that you have to meet online, there's no reason that should be the primary way you're engaging with church. You should be primarily engaging with church in person. But here's the question, or the rub, right? Because people are making fun of him, and you probably caught why. Because he's like, church isn't a production. Zoom out, he's got screens, right? It's a huge stage. He has clearly rooms, like stuff in the back for for people who are playing instruments, and it is a production at so many of these really big churches. Like, you could say it's not, but that's what it is. And they have a great team. Like, they have multiple camera angles, right? We don't have that. We have one camera that we can do cool stuff with, but we don't get multiple angles. And so I think what's really interesting here is that we see that the way that we do church for the vast majority of people who attend churches in the United States is that people don't is that we end up treating it not like a gathering of believers, but rather just a personal experience they're going to enjoy. I mean, look, it's dark in there. You can't see anyone but him, right? It's much like a stage. There's all sorts of ways you can critique this. And there's ways you can critique our worship, I'm sure, right? I'm not saying that we're perfect. I need to make that clear, because every time you make these statements, everyone thinks that you think you're perfect. No, I don't think we're perfect. I think if you like the way our church does worship, then we're perfect for you. But I could understand that there are different needs from different people. I generally think big, mega churches are really good to get new believers in. What I've seen is generally as believers kind of get older and more wiser, then they end up finding these things really stale because the teaching ends up kind of being very surface level, stuff like that. But that's neither here nor there. What's important is that if we are going to try and recover the Church of James, or understanding kind of what church is about, we need to understand kind of what it looked like, and that's why I wanted to look at these passages. But I also wanted to show you guys, because some of you are visual learners here, I wanted to show you a picture of a Roman house. So here's a Roman house with all the Latin stuff in there. So you have, this would be a typical one. Even the poorer folks would have smaller versions of these. Sometimes you would share them with other families, but this is generally how they look. So you would have a house that was kind of not wide but long, and the opening you'll see kind of over here into the front of the house where the door is. There's little openings. That's usually you would run shops out of those. So your shop, because if you lived in a city, chances are you were someone who was trading, or you were selling your produce if you were a farmer in the countryside, right? That's where you would sell a lot of stuff, unless you were going to take it to the forum or to the marketplace and sell it there, right? But generally in cities, that's where the church was mostly located. The downstairs front would be used as storage and store space. So you would go in, and then you would get past that area and you'd get into the atrium. And the atrium is where the house proper begins. That's where you would live. And sometimes they would have 2 floors or 3 floors. We could tell the house that Paul was at here, where the guy fell out the window, was probably a rich person's house, and because it had 3 floors. And these would be places where you would have, there'd be an atrium with a pool in the middle, and there would then be rooms around that. And you would have kitchen and stuff like that in the other places near the back. And in the back, you had a garden. And that would kind of be the average home. And you could see that this is where people would meet, right? They would meet in the upper room, which would kind of be this area back here. And that's where they would eat and things like that. And so that's what the Christian houses looked like. This is what an average place you would worship looked like. It was someone's home. Sometimes I would guess that it was probably a rich person's house, but not all the time. And you have to remember that there's this idea at the earliest times that you would not get super big congregations because Christianity was mostly underground. You would meet in small groups, and that's how it would work. So that's what it looked like. That's an early church right there. I think there's a lot. I mean, there is something romantic about this to me, that this is this thing was so simple. There was no upkeep, right? These days you could move from house to house. Even back then, right? It'd be much more intimate, things like that. But of course, once you get to a certain level, this just isn't really worth it anymore. So next, I wanted to talk about this right here, and I know you can't probably see that all that well, but this is the house church of Dura Europa. Now, Dura Europa is a town in Syria, which I think is pretty much destroyed right now after ISIS took it over back a few years ago. which is a shame. But there they had a really, really well-preserved Roman town from the mid-200s. So this is about 200 years after, and by this point, Christianity, especially in the Middle East and in other places, is becoming a large group, right? It's not just small groups of people. It's pretty big. Now, this is a house church, but it's actually a church, mostly. It was a house that was bought and then turned into a church. Something to note about Dura Europa is in Syria, right next to the border of the Persian Empire. So when you were farther away from centers of power, you could be a little bit more open about what you were doing. And so you didn't have to worry as much about worshiping public and people knowing that you're a Christian. In fact, the Dura Europa is great for understanding religion of this period because not only do you have a church, you also have a synagogue with pictures in it, which today, if you go to most synagogues, you will not see any pictures, but we actually have paintings and pictures of people from the Old Testament. So you can see kind of how like Jewish worship this has changed over time. But you also see like temples to Bel and temples to Mithra and stuff like that. See Mithras, and so you can see like all sorts of really interesting, or it could. ISIS, I think, destroyed all of this stuff, which is really unfortunate. But luckily, a lot of it has been cataloged. But what this was is this was a house, and you can see kind of the same structure. You see the atrium kind of in the middle. You see the rooms off to the side. You see probably an area that used to be kind of a storefront. But all this was taken out and turned into a church, which is really interesting because now, I mean, so many churches are closing. Churches are being turned into houses or into businesses. But back then, right, it was expanding. So you'd need a place to worship, and so they would meet there. And this is a recreation right here. I got this from Wikipedia of the baptismal font that was in this house. And I believe that the depiction, they had depictions of Jesus and stuff like that in here. Nothing like we see them now. Like he doesn't have a beard. He looks like a Roman, right? Because they're Romans, so they're going to draw Jesus to look like them. And I believe it is... There's one of him telling the man to pick up his cot and walk. There's that one. I believe that this one is his baptism, but I'm not certain. And again, this is a recreation of what it might have looked like. It looks like ruins by the time that people got there, outside of a few things they were able to see. But it was really well preserved because of the desert. So anyway, I bring this up, and this is a baptistry, right? Because now they had a place to put water, and people could be baptized in there, which was done naked, by the way. Male or female, it doesn't matter. You would be naked, and no one else would see it. You know how we do baptisms publicly? Baptisms were done between, there would be the person who is kind of your helper, which if you were a woman was a woman, and if you were a man was a man, and then the priest. So all the pastors would see you naked if they baptized you. And it's pretty interesting for that reason. Again, you can see how culture changes, right? What nudity was a lot more comfortable back then. It's not comfortable now. So obviously, if you did something like this, this is how you get a lawsuit on your hands, right? But I wanted to talk about this because if we are going to hold up churches being hospitable, churches being a family, churches being, how do we do it in a way that's compelling? We have to understand kind of where we've been in the past. And I think the goal of church is to try and downplay when we do this, is to worship God, downplay the building as much as possible, and focus rather on how do we, the grouping of people that make up the church. And I know that's like such a sappy thing that, church isn't a building, it's the people who are in it. But there is a truth to that, because the church at first wasn't buildings, it was a gathering. And I think the way to challenge people is with that, in both building and non-building, is reminding people that worship is not about them, but about God, right? I mean, how many people, like Paul would get poor marks from most people today, right? If they came to church, they'd be like, I wasn't very entertained by his preaching. The goal of preaching isn't to entertain you, right? It's to make you think about God and to keep your mind on him. That's kind of the thing, right? So I wanted to talk about that just because I saw this video, and I think it's helpful to think about these things that have happened in the past and things like that. So thank you for being here. I hope this was interesting to many of you, and I will see you at our own gathering on Sunday in church. So have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and peace out.